Hello and welcome to Practical Inclusion. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of which I broadcast to you from today, which is the land of the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who happen to be watching live today or on the replay. Just as an addition to my acknowledgement today, we know that Ida Hobbit is approaching. So next week it's the International Day Against, let me get this right, Day Against Transphobia, Biphobia, Interphobia. And of course, many organisations are running around and looking for speakers to run a morning tea or a session, whatever it may be. And I know, because I'm being asked from a lot of organisations, that sometimes this is quite last minute, which has its issues, but also we need to start somewhere, don't we? If you are looking to organise something for Ida Hobbit, or perhaps you're looking in advance towards other events that you might do and looking for speakers, there are some incredible Aboriginal queer people who would give amazing presentations that you could reach out to. A couple have been on my show previously, Rebecca Hunt, for one, Courtney Hagan at Cricket Australia, Matika Little. There's a whole range of people you could reach out to and seek a presentation from. So there's a couple of recommendations from me, and if you're watching live or on the replay and you've got some other queer Aboriginal folk that you think would be fantastic for organisations to reach out to, then please place them in the comments in the chat there. Today I'm on my own. We're doing Q&A time, which I've done a couple of times, and each time I've got some incredible questions come through from you to address, and today's no different. I've got a list of questions here that people have sent through that I'll attempt to work my way through. If you are watching and you have a question, please feel free to put that in the comments and I will get to it if I can, and if not, I will certainly bench it for the next episode. So let's jump straight in, because I've got a few to get through and I'm not sure I will. Again, always place any comments or thoughts about anything I'm saying. I don't profess to be right on any of these topics. I'm providing you my opinion and I'm really interested in yours. So please feel free to type in the comments if you have a different opinion, or if you have something to add or something to question. So the first one I wanted to tackle today that came through was around gathering diversity data and information. And if you've been watching my show for a while, you'll know this is my favourite topic. I have spoken on it again, so I'm not going to speak on it at length. But the question that came through was how to gather diversity information in a fully inclusive way. And I really enjoyed the way the question was asked, because it's so true that we are constantly, well, some organisations are collecting diversity data. We still have such a huge number of organisations who don't collect the data or don't have an appetite to collect that data currently. And we're hoping that is changing as time goes by. But organisations that are collecting data at many times aren't actually collecting that in an inclusive way. And when I think about this question, there's a number of angles you can come at this. One thing is remembering the way that people like to engage with processes. So if you are conducting a consultation with your employees, with your clients, customers, and you are interested in hearing their experiences and their thoughts, then you need to make sure there are a variety of ways that they can engage with that consultation process, because not everybody's comfortable attending a focus group. Not everybody's able to think on the spot and provide their thoughts and experiences. They might want to contribute in a different way. And so surveys are always a good way to do that, and making sure in your surveys that you are asking inclusive questions, and you have opportunities for people always to prefer not to say. If you're asking them a demographic question, to give them opportunity to write comments, particularly for those people who won't want to talk in a focus group but do want to have their opinion and their experiences heard. So always providing some open-ended questions and comment boxes. And one thing that I really wanted to pick out, because we are coming up to Ida Hobbit Day, is making sure that if you are collecting data around gender, that you're getting that right. I've talked about this at length. There are not two genders, and there are right and wrong ways to collect information around gender. You can find that out. There's plenty of guides on the web now helping you through that. But make sure, as I say, there's a prefer not to say and there's a prefer to self-describe. People may not align with the gender options that you provide for them. So give them an opportunity to describe gender as they see it and how it is described, what it means to them. Recently, I was made aware of a consultation process that was an organisational-wide consultation process that was on a particular topic, but that wasn't restricted to diversity and inclusion, but it certainly had a different impact on people from different demographic groups. But there was hesitation, and in the end, they didn't collect any demographic data on the participants. Now, I understand that organisations get scared and that researchers get scared that if they ask demographic information, people will feel that their confidentiality is at risk, and so they won't respond. I get where people are coming from with this, but if you provide an option for people not to say, then what is the harm in asking the question? Because people do have different experiences in the workplace based on their identity, their demographics, their lived experience. And if we're not capturing that, then any solutions or any conclusions that we make are perhaps just reiterating the status quo and we're looking at percentages quite often. And so we're providing the experience of the majority and not of those who are underrepresented. I can't talk to this enough. We have to get through our fear about collecting data. We have to do it ethically and logically and rationally, but we do have to collect that data if we really want to understand the experiences of people and the different barriers that present to different people. Edwin, thank you so much. Put a link there for the use of appropriate language from the ABS. That's awesome. Great, useful content there for people to go to. All right, next question. The next question was one that I did answer in my last Q&A session, which was around where do we start on diversity and inclusion. And it is still by far the question that I get asked the most from organisations, from people signing up to my mailing list on the website. There's a little quiz there for people to fill out. And it's always, what do you need to know? And it's, where do I start? And my answer has not changed. It is, start with the data. Absolutely, you need to listen to the people that are in your organisation and interacting with your organisation. And you need to look at the workplace profile data that you have as well. Diversity and inclusion, doing those two things at the same time, but really understanding what's your baseline, where are you starting from, what specific barriers exist in your organisation, because you can't be developing a whole bunch of actions based on what everybody else is doing when that might not be the problem within your organisation, or it might not be the priority for your employees or for your customers and clients. So I'll stop it there because I do talk about that a lot. I do have a process that I work through with organisations, and I'm always happy to share that. So reach out if you've got any questions around any of that. And now let's get on to a fun question that came through. The question was, how do you address men who feel disenfranchised in the workplace due to gender equity targets or strategies? And it's a bit of fun, but it's also quite serious, right? Because we know that we do get backlash when we're doing diversity and inclusion work from men who feel threatened or fearful that their progress through that organisation will now be stalled. It will be much more difficult for them to reach the leadership roles that, I guess, the career track that they thought that they were on. It is true that when you start doing gender equity work properly, then men may need to compete harder for those leadership roles that they have always wanted to apply for. There's no way to get around that. An example I really like to use here, though, is Fujitsu. Fujitsu introduced balanced shortlisting. Once they had used the balanced shortlisting, I think it was for about a year, they monitored how that went. They found that at the end of the balanced shortlisting, 50% of people that they had hired through that process were women. So yes, they increased the number of women they were hiring by using balanced shortlisting, but they increased it to 50%. Does that change the amount of people that a man in that organisation is competing against when they apply for a role? Maybe, maybe not. Does it change the makeup of the people applying for the role? Yes, it does. Does it stop the privilege that those potentially white men have within the organisation? Not entirely at all. We know diversity and inclusion initiatives tackle, a few parts of the recruitment process. Not many organisations yet are actually tackling bias throughout the entirety of the recruitment process. So I don't think there's too much concern there. The other thing I liked, and so that's one example where, yes, it helped. What did it change in representation? They went from 27% women in the organisation to 31%. So 5% increase through balanced shortlisting. I really don't think that's a huge threat to the men who were in that organisation or wanting to create careers within that organisation. Let's keep the statistics in mind, I guess. The other thing to think of is if you are a white man and you think that diversity and inclusion initiatives are preventing you from achieving the success that you want, maybe it's time that you took a career change. So we know that nursing, teaching, aged care are all professions that are desperately wanting to increase the number of men who care, who teach. And we know that men who move into these professions benefit from the catapult effect. They come into the industry and they jump through a whole range of levels and people, and particularly women, to reach leadership roles at a much faster rate than the women who are already in that industry. So if you do have men in your organisation who are all worried that now the only appointments in tech are women, which we actually know is completely incorrect, but say we buy that, then maybe the suggestion is that a career change would be fantastic for them. I jest and I laugh about this. I was in a recent training session where a woman actually said, it must be really difficult now for white men to get promotions and to find employment. And I didn't have to say anything. A white man stopped the conversation, interrupted, and said, I'm a white straight man and I don't have any trouble looking for employment or promotion. Maybe we stop there. I think that's the answer to the question. Would you use my language and my way of explaining it if you were dealing with men in your organisation who are feeling a bit put out by the gender equity work? No. You would perhaps present that in a much more palatable way. We know that people learn best when they're not defensive. And so we want to do this in a non-confrontational way. We want to build their empathy and understanding as to why we need to do gender equity work. We want to build their understanding about why it's good for business. And we want to make sure that they do feel still supported in the workplace, because that's our ultimate goal, that everybody feels supported in the workplace. So that's the real answer, and the rest is a bit of food for thought, perhaps. So the question that I had myself that I wanted to address, and I was glad that somebody reached out to add to my question, actually, was around CVs. And this is, by the way, this is the last question I have written down, so that if you've got any questions you want me to address, please put them in. Oh, sorry, no, I've got one more. Then I'm happy to answer any other questions. I was doing some work for a public Victorian organisation this week who is required by the new Gender Equality Act to do gender impact assessments. And so I was doing a gender impact assessment around a recruitment process. And I stumbled across this excellent blog article, actually, that talked to the value of CVs in the recruitment process. And there was some research done that showed that if you want to predict the skills of a candidate, the least successful ways to do that are through through knowing their years of experience, through the education that they have, and through reference checks. So 2 of those things are really what forms the basis of our CVs and the reference check process as well. The 3 things that most accurately predicted a person's skill level was actually doing work samples at interview. So a work sample is essentially providing them with a hypothetical situation and asking them to respond to that. So an example in this particular blog article of a work sample for diversity and inclusion professionals was around, imagine you've walked into, you're in a meeting and somebody is, maybe they've raised this idea that the men are feeling disengaged in the workplace since we started gender equity work. How would you respond? So you're actually asking people to do the work that they would have to do in the role that they've applied for. Does that make sense? I've done this in recruitment for years. So while I was a manager at Deakin University, I always provided people with case studies or hypothetical situations to either work through ahead of time. So in a couple of cases, I would set them a task a few days prior to the interview that would give them time to do the research that was required to come up with a response or an answer, which is what I would ask of them in the role that they were in. I wouldn't ask them to have the answer for me right on the spot. For those particular roles, they could go away and do the work and then present it to me. And so that's what I would do. I would set them those tasks and ask them to present that to the interview panel. I just think it's a highly successful way of interviewing people, because you can't predict someone's capability from their CV. And we know reference checks are pretty much rubbish. There's that excellent story that study that showed us that one reviewer or one referee is asked to provide a referee for 2 people, and those 2 reference letters are much closer and much more similar than if you get 2 referees to write a letter for 1 person. The reference letter comes out as a reflection of the referee, not of the person that they're providing the reference for. And we know also that those reference letters get impacted highly by bias. So cut that out. That's not really of much value to us at all. Years of experience is one of the biggest barriers to recruiting for diversity. Time over task. If we're wanting to hire somebody to be a manager in an IT space, then the pool, yes, people always respond and say, look, the talent pool just doesn't have the diversity. No, not if you're looking at that specific talent pool. Not if you think that for that role you have to have worked in the IT industry for 20 years. Maybe somebody who's been a manager in a totally different industry can bring a great set of skills and experience to that role that's going to set them up for success. So thinking outside the box, moving away from this idea that people have to have experience in the industry that the role is within. And then education. Sure, education can help in some ways. It's also not a predictor of skills at all either. We know the varying qualities of education, and we know the varying content of tertiary qualifications. It depends on which uni you went to, what type of content you absorbed. Is that the actual work that you're having to do in this role, or is it actually quite different? We place so much emphasis on that. Most diversity and inclusion roles ask for a HR qualification. Most successful diversity and inclusion professionals don't have a HR qualification. So that's what we find in the CV. The other thing, it was work samples, and then it was structured interviews. We know most larger organisations are doing structured interviews, but still, and particularly in male-dominated areas, we're not seeing structured interviews at all. We're still seeing one person has a casual chat, and then they either get the role or don't get the role. So we need to bring in structured interviews, and we need to stick to our questions so that we're not using our bias to help or hinder that particular applicant in that interview process. And the third thing that was shown was cognitive ability tests. And we're seeing more and more organisations take on some form of that. I really enjoyed reading about gamification of the recruitment process too. I don't think that works for all roles, clearly, because I think there's some barriers that gamification brings to certain people, particularly around the use of technology. And I think it does give gamers a particular advantage in that case. But there is some really great emerging evidence that gamification for some roles and for some industries has been really successful in accessing a much more diverse talent pool, even using gamification to get people in. So we know, I read some research that showed that on average, and of course all of this research is binary, which is really frustrating, but we don't have data on other underrepresented genders. But looking at men and women, on average, men and women look at the same amount of roles when they're job hunting. So they go through and they research and they look at about the same amount of roles, but women are 20% less likely to apply. So how do you encourage women to jump over that hurdle and actually apply in the first place? And remember, it's not about a lack of confidence. Don't want that myth to keep perpetuating itself. It's not that women are less confident, it's that they don't want to waste your time because they don't think they're fully qualified, or that the person that you're looking for, or it's about the fact that your leadership team has zero diversity, that they can't see themselves in the leadership team at the organisation, that you don't have flexibility, etc., etc. It is not about confidence. So have I rounded that out? That's why I think CVs are a waste of time. I think the evidence is showing us that there are much better ways to be recruiting, and we shouldn't be relying on CVs. And we know our reliance on CVs narrows our talent pool and reduces the diversity of the people that we could get through the door. So that's kind of where my thinking's at around recruitment, and particularly around CVs. I'll just check some of the comments and questions here. Just wondering if that static gender equity achieved through hiring remained so by the end of the year for Fujitsu. The research I showed, it was that they'd done a year. I think it was a year. I can find the link and post it in here. They didn't post a lot of information about it, but I know they were quite proud that they'd increased the representation of women by 5%, which is not a small feat. That is actually a good step. But remember, if it's taken that measure to get a 5% change, what do they have to do to really keep pushing the dial, I suppose? But I can send the link to the research. So Cass said CV and reference checking is basically a deeply flawed process. I think so, absolutely. What is your take on group assessments when recruiting? I was doing some research on this. And the evidence seemed really quite mixed. Yes, group interviews could help people. So we know that if you put one woman or person from a minority group into a recruitment process, they have zero chance of getting hired. Right? So the more diversity we can put into the pool, then the greater the chance of people from minority backgrounds being employed into the role. And so, I guess extrapolating from that, there was some research to say, so therefore group interviews really help, because if you have a diverse group of people in that who are being interviewed in that group setting, then that can help reduce our bias. And I think there's a lot of validity in that. That makes sense. But also we know that people don't always feel empowered to show their true selves in a group interview. That can be sometimes that can be more threatening than a single interview. So I think if we're going to recruit, we have to make sure we don't rely on one method at any time. And we have to think about what's required for that role. Is that person required to be able to think on the spot? Are they required to be able to operate in, a group environment? That's not always the case. And how do we recognize nervousness and anxiety in interviews, and whether they're group or whether they're individual? And how do we account for that? Because we can be missing out on great talent because they just got too nervous at interview, and we know that that's just such a staged process. It's not reflective of most of the jobs that people take on. So I haven't got to the answer there, Kath, but it's interesting, fascinates me. Alan's do you have any advice on how to build empathy around gender equity challenges to help get buy-in on initiatives? The method I use to build empathy is storytelling and sharing lived experience. I still think, and the evidence that I've read certainly suggests that that's still the best way to engage people with gender equity or any types of equity and diversity initiatives. And so I think, so my answer is storytelling and sharing lived experience. We know that exposure to diversity, exposure to people who are unlike you, is what, with time, does change, does engage you with this topic and takes you out of that apathy stage. Alan, Vic Health had some good research that they released this year around how to engage people who are apathetic to diversity and inclusion. Theirs was actually specifically gender equity, so to your point. So if you search up Vic Health, they had some, I believe they had some good conclusions there around the types of messaging you could use to really engage people. But yeah, my approach is certainly through storytelling, sharing lived experience, sharing stories with each other. So when I do a session around inclusive leadership, I actually get people to share stories with each other as the first activity, because I think that's what I believe works, and there is some evidence to suggest that. Now, we have got 2 minutes to go. There was one question I didn't get to that I should get to, and that was the question around misgendering people. And so the question was, I find it difficult to remember to use the correct pronouns on people who my brain automatically assumes a gender for. And we know this, I know this, it still happens to me. We assume a gender for someone and we might refer to them in our head as a she or a he, when in fact that's not how they identify or want to be referred to at all. It's tricky. It's absolutely tricky. I have many people in my life who use pronouns that are either different to the pronouns that they used when I met them, or that are using they, them pronouns. And I find it difficult as well, and still trip up occasionally. What can you do? Of course, we say it time and time again, the best way is to just quickly apologise and move on. But how can you stop yourself from doing it in the first place? I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I think it's just time and exposure. So it's spending more and more time with people who are different from you, who are gender diverse or trans, and getting used to referring to them with a pronoun that wouldn't be the first one that you would have chosen for them. I'm not sure there's a quick way around it other than just time and trying to be so much more conscious about the language that we use. My go-to move, though, is we should be dropping gender from our language anyway, regardless of what gender people are presenting as. You know, I was at a queer event recently and I got called woman twice and lady once within a period of 2 hours. Now, this is a queer event. Now, I personally don't mind being called woman. I hate ladies, but nobody should make that assumption for me anyway. Why do we think it's okay to make the assumption around gender still? Why aren't we just saying people, person, using names? We don't need to be referring to people by gender or gendered pronouns at all, in my opinion. So that's the track I would head down. Drop gendered language as much as possible. It's not necessary. So yeah, I'm not sure I've completely answered the question. It's difficult, it's challenging, but we have to try and we have to keep trying harder. And if somebody does get upset at you because you are using the wrong pronouns, then that's okay for them to do that. And I think being compassionate about that and not getting defensive when we get called out on it is really important, because in this particular case, perhaps their experiences and what they're experiencing every day, 3, 4, 5 times a day, makes their response totally reasonable in the circumstances, and that it's up to us to try harder. All right, well, that's time up. I have to end. Can't let myself go longer. I don't let my guests go longer than the 30 minutes. Look forward to chatting again next week. Enjoy your week. The weather's revolting here. I hope it's a little bit better where you are. And I'll talk to you again soon. And really, thank you so much to everybody who sent through questions. It was fantastic, and it's great that you're all engaging. And I really appreciate the support that you're giving me in this business and on this show. Thanks, everybody. Bye.